Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. Welcome to this episode of the Hello Therapy podcast. I am your host, Dr. Liz White, consultant clinical psychologist with 20 years experience in the mental health field. Do you ever wish that your inner critic could just give you a break? That you could quiet that voice that gives you such a hard time and makes you feel really bad about yourself? Well, in today's episode, we are delving in to how to tame your inner critic, drawing on compassion-focused therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy techniques and strategies. And I'm going to call them CFT and ACT for short. So being self-critical is like any pattern of thinking. It's habitual. So, whatever our inner critic says, we listen. We take it on board as if what it is saying to us is true. However, like any habit, we can change self-criticism with a little bit of work. And if you're not sure whether you do get caught up in the habit of self-criticism, then check out episode 7 of this podcast, where I walk you through how you can tell if you are self-critical. And I also discuss the different versions or different forms of self-criticism. But in this episode, I'm going to focus more on the harmful form of self-criticism, the one that is very attacking and tends to induce guilt and shame. So let's just dive into tip number 1. Acknowledge your context. So Professor Paul Gilbert, who first developed CFT, highlights the importance of acknowledging that we are all born into a society that functions on the ideals of competition. From our schooling to the job market to reality TV to social media, pretty much all facets of our society, at least Western society, are touched by the idea of being in competition with others. And this in of itself triggers the threat system in our brains in order for us to survive and thrive in today's modern world. And I think that just holding this in mind can be really helpful. That there's something outside of us that pulls us into feeling a sense of comparison and competition. And I think this helps us get in touch with the concept of common humanity, which is something that Kristin Neff describes in her description of self-compassion. And that is that, we're all in the same boat as human beings. We're not alone in feeling this or feeling not good enough sometimes or less than other people. And I think if we can hold this in mind, it does help. So my second tip is this. A good starting point is to first notice when your inner critic is showing up. And I do talk more about this in episode 7, but essentially it is crucial that you catch when you are being self-critical if you want to change this habit. Essentially you need to build awareness of it when it's there. And you can do this by slowing down, slowing the pace, taking a moment to stop, taking a moment to breathe and ask yourself, what is my mind saying? Is my inner critic showing up right now? And try and identify what it is saying along with, and this is important, the tone of voice that it uses. Now, when you do this, you are practicing the skill of what we call in ACT, diffusing. So you're stepping back from and observing your thoughts rather than being caught up with them. And that leads in nicely to my third tip, the notion of different selves. So a helpful way to think about ourselves and how we function is that different emotional selves sit within us, and each self or each part can influence our mind, can influence how we feel emotionally and physically in our bodies. Now, your inner critic is one such self or version of the different parts of you. And there can be other parts like your angry self or your anxious self and so on. You are a complex and multifaceted human being, and like the rest of us, experience a really wide range of emotions and mind-body states that can be really hard to experience sometimes. An essential idea of CFT, and if you're multitasking right now, just come back to me because this is important. You did not design your brain this way. It's just how your brain has evolved over millions of years. And perhaps more crucially, this idea that you are not broken or damaged or deserving of harsh internal rhetoric. So you may have noticed that I am using the term your inner critic. And that's because referring to that part of you that shows up and, beats you up internally and spits that harsh internal rhetoric, it's just one part of you. It's not the whole. And one way of taming or even silencing your inner critic is to use a different part, a different self in those moments when you need it, in those moments when your inner critic is really running the show. And that is a lovely segue to the next tip. Use your compassionate self. So this is a core component of CFT and the idea of what it means to be self-compassionate. So I've talked about the inner critic or the critical self or critical part of you, but did you know that there is also a compassionate part of you too? Now it may be hidden, but I am confident that it's there. Now let me show you what I mean. Think about the last time someone you really cared about was in need of help. So just for a moment, just really drop into that memory. What was the situation? What did you do? What was happening? Perhaps you were a shoulder to cry on because your friend broke up with their partner, or maybe you were tending to your child's scraped knee because they'd fallen over in the garden, or maybe you gave your partner a hug because they'd had a really, really tough day and you were offering some soothing words. Now, in those moments, you are using what I like to call your compassionate self, the part of you that encompasses all of the attributes that make up compassion. So when someone is in need of support or going through a tough time, you use that self to empathize with that person. You try and understand what they're going through. You care about their well-being and what has happened to them in that moment. You're able to be sensitive and tolerate their distress without being consumed by it yourself. You are coming from a place of non-judgment, and most importantly, you sympathize with that person, meaning that you're moved to take action to alleviate that distress. So whether that's putting disinfectant and plaster on a scraped knee, or giving a hug, or getting tissues for tears and being a listening ear. So the challenge then is to somehow tap into that compassionate part or that compassionate self when you are suffering, when you are in distress, to direct those qualities towards yourself when you need it. Now, if you're very self-critical, this is going to be a real challenge because, as I said at the beginning, being self-critical is a habit. Habits are hard to break. But also there may be certain blocks or resistance to being compassionate towards yourself. And I talk about this a lot more in episode 8, which is a guest episode with Susie Redding. And we get into all sorts of things around self-care, redefining rest, but particularly sort of talking about how can you be self-caring when you're self-critical. Now, if this is you, if you're resonating with this idea of actually, I'm going to find this whole self-compassion thing really, really difficult, try and reflect on what that resistance actually is. What is in your way? why not direct warmth, kindness, and compassion towards yourself? Just have a think about that. Now, a starting point could be this. The next time you are suffering, or the next time you're in a really difficult moment, or you've had a tough day and your inner critic is really, really, really giving you a hard time, try this. So firstly, calm your nervous system, because when your inner critic is at play, you are using the part of your brain that is designed to help you survive, because your brain has detected a threat. And when you're in this mind state, you are galvanized to either run away from the threat or to fight it. And what we want to try and do is to get your rest and digest system, or your soothing system, online. And you can do this by slowing your breathing down. So really focusing on the breath and just trying to focus on that sensation of slowing down. And then acknowledge that, wow, this is a really difficult moment that I'm having. And then ask yourself this key question: what do I need to hear right now? And it helps if you have done a little work beforehand on some key self-compassionate statements that you have in your back pocket, as it were. So 2 to 3 statements that you know will help you when you are suffering. So it can be things like, it's going to be okay. This will pass. I'll get through this. So here, what we're doing is we're trying to tap into that compassionate part of yourself and, crucially, say these statements in a warm, friendly tone. So say them as if you are saying them to that person in need, to the friend or to the child, whoever it is. Say it in that tone. Now, a bonus tip, and something that my clients find really useful, is that when you have identified those self-compassionate statements, try saying them in a voice note in your phone that you can keep for when you need it. So the simple act of hearing yourself say those things to yourself when you need them can be so powerful. So just give it a go. Now, there are lots of other ways you can develop self-compassion and learn how to sort of switch on that soothing system in your brain, which I will cover in future episodes. But I want to leave you with a really powerful tool, which involves taking quite a big perspective shift. Now, if you're in a really tough moment and your compassionate self is nowhere to be seen because all you can hear is your inner critic, try and switch on that soothing system either by doing the breathing exercises and slowing down your breathing, or trying to remind yourself of what you do when you're being compassionate towards someone else. A bit like we did earlier, that sort of dropping into a memory kind of thing. So you just want to sort of remind yourself what it's like to be compassionate, and then ask yourself this question: what does the compassionate part of me want to say to the self-critical part of me? So let's take an example. Let's say you have had a really bad argument with your partner and you've said a lot of things, a lot of hurtful things that you really wish that you hadn't said. And it's that sort of after the argument period of time where you're by yourself and you're really, really giving yourself a hard time, or your inner critic is giving you a really hard time. So what does the compassionate part of you say to the self-critical part? Well, it might go something like this: I know that you're giving me a hard time right now because you want to try and prevent me from messing another relationship up, from sabotaging another relationship, because that's what I do, or that's what I've done in the past. But when you do that, it makes me feel awful, and it makes me feel like I can't be in a relationship with someone because I'm so damaged. And I think what this does is that it sort of opens up a little bit of wriggle room. Taking that perspective of almost talking to your inner critic helps you tap into a more compassionate place or a more compassionate part of yourself. Because what you're doing there, you can sort of more easily see the impact that the self-criticism is having. And from that position, you can access the compassion. And that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you found that helpful and that you feel empowered to try some of the tips to help tame your inner critic. But don't worry, I will be doing future episodes on this because self-criticism is one of my favourite areas to talk about. I do also have a blog titled 3 Powerful Ways to Help Manage Your Inner Critic, so do check that out. I'll link it in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.